All right, I'm going to go ahead and warn y'all this morning. Most of the time, I stick to one passage. I don't jump around a lot. But this morning, I'm actually going to jump around some, okay? So if you look on your listening guide, it shows you exactly where I'm going, so you'll know where I'm going before I get there. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. And we're going to talk about a topic that affects all of us. We're finishing up living through Jesus, seeing how Jesus handled certain situations in his life so that we could apply them to our lives. And this topic today, we all have to deal with it. Whether we like it or not, we're going to have to deal with it. And here's the thing, we're on both ends of it. You realize that? Because at some point in our life, we're going to do something wrong to somebody else, and then they're going to have to forgive us. But then on the flip side, somebody's going to do something wrong to us, and we're going to have to forgive them. So it's a two-way street, and we'll have to deal with it both ways. And so what I wanted to do today as we finish this up is to look at how Jesus handled forgiveness. Because we know that he was done wrong, but how did he handle it? So our big idea today, if you look on your listening guide, is we receive forgiveness through the gospel, and we must also offer forgiveness because of the gospel. So we receive forgiveness through the gospel, and we also must offer forgiveness because of the gospel. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 21. It says, "And Peter came and he said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts among his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. But since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife and his children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. And so the slave fell on the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him of the debt. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him and he began to choke him, saying, Pay back what you owe. And so his fellow slave fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you. But he was unwilling, and he went and he threw him in prison until he should pay back what he owed. And so when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to their Lord all that had happened. And then summoning him, his Lord said to him, You wicked slave, I forgave you of all the debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have mercy on your fellow slave, in the same way that I have mercy on you? And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart." Well, the first point on your listening guide is Jesus taught that forgiveness is a core quality of his followers. Jesus taught that forgiveness is a core quality of his followers. So as we start this passage, we kind of had to get context for this passage. And what I mean by context is what's happening here when Jesus talks about forgiveness. See, he had just talked about there was a dispute in the church, and he said this is how you should deal with that. And then he starts to talk about forgiveness. And Peter comes to him and he makes a statement. Verse 21, Peter said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times. Now, you have to understand what Peter's saying there and what's going on there. See, the rabbis during that time, they said that you should forgive somebody 3 times. So if they do something against you, you can forgive them 3 times. But when you got to that 4th time and they did something against you, you didn't have to forgive them. Because they had done everything and they have kept doing it so that you just basically don't need to forget them. You can basically just write them off. So Peter comes and he gives a higher number. Now why he chose 7, I don't know. Maybe he said, I'll double what the teaching is. The teaching's 3, so I'll double it, and then I'll just add 1 more just to look really good. So I'll say 7. But he's showing us something. In the human mindset, there's a limit to forgiveness being offered. You realize that? That at some point, we just say, I'm tired of forgiving you. And at some point, we just say, I'm done with you. Think about that. How many times are you willing to forgive somebody before you're saying, I'm done with you? You ever thought about that? Because that's basically what Peter is addressing here. He's saying, well, what if I forgive somebody 7 times? What happens after the 7th time? I'm done with them. What happens after the 3rd time? I'm done with them. So how many times are we willing to forgive somebody? Well, Jesus replies to him. Look at verse 22. Jesus replies and says, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Basically, he's telling him that your forgiveness should be limitless. Now, I know what some of y'all are going to say. Y'all are doing the math in your head. You're probably saying, well, 70 times 7 is 490. So that means Jesus said that after 490 times, then that means that you'll say, okay, I'm done with you. What Jesus is doing is throwing out a large number. Because think about it. How many of y'all have a calendar somewhere in your house or your office or somewhere, and that when you forgive somebody, you go to your calendar and you write it down. There's number 1. And then you go to number 2, and then number 3, so that when you hit 489, you're thinking to yourself, 1 more time, and I'm done with you. Do we do that? We don't do that, do we? What Jesus is trying to say is, by the time you get to 490, guess what? It's a habit that you're forgiving them. People say that if you do something for 21 days, it becomes a habit. Well, Jesus is going way above that. He's saying do it for 490 times, because when you hit that 490 time, guess what? It's a habit that you're going to forget them. You're already in that mindset that you're going to forgive them. And you're going to keep forgiving them. Because we are all flawed. You realize that? We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. We all mess up. You realize that? Turn to the person beside you and say, you've messed up. Turnabout's fair play. Go ahead and turn to the other person and say, you've messed up too. We've all messed up, have we not? Jesus is saying that forgiveness is limitless. We keep forgiving somebody again and again. I kind of compare Peter's 7 times and Jesus' 490 times to technology. When I was in high school, I had a class that I had to take, and it was typewriting. How many of y'all remember typewriters? I hated that class. I'll go ahead and tell you that, because this is what the teacher did. We'd sit down in front of the typewriter, and she would make us put a piece of paper over the keyboard, and so our hands would be under the keyboard, or like under the paper, and she would tell us to type something, and I would look down at my hands thinking, where are the keys? And I would have to hunt and peck and all that. And typewriters, for the younger ones, typewriters is when you hit it, it would take and put a mark on the paper. And then if you messed up, they had these things called correction ribbon, right? And you could correct what you put down. Or if it was too bad, you'd pull out the whiteout. How many of y'all remember whiteout? And you would white out everything, and then you would have to line it back up and put it back in and all. But here's the thing. How many times would you mess up before you just took the piece of paper and wadded it up and threw it in the trash and started over? You'd eventually do it, right? Because if you kept typing and you kept messing up, that piece of paper is going to look worse and worse and worse. And that's Peter's mindset, because he's saying, well, if I mess up typing 7 times, then I'm going to take that piece of paper and I'm going to throw it away. But the piece of paper is a person. And he's saying, I'm done with them. But nowadays, typewriters are gone, right? Actually, they're starting to make a comeback where writers are saying, I want to be old school, and they're using typewriters now. But for most people today, they have the word processors, right? You've got your Microsoft that you'll use, or Google Docs, or something of that assortment where you're typing everything in, and it's on a word processor, and if you mess up, they've got this cool key. What's the key called? Backspace. And then if you mess up a whole bunch, you can highlight the whole thing and hit the delete key, and then guess what? You can restart. And so that you're not throwing things away, you just correct it as you go. But then there's another good thing about this, because you can save a document, then you can come back 2 months later, pull the document back up, realize you made a mistake, and you could change it then from 2 months ago. And it also can tell you when you've messed up, because you'll be typing along and I'll see something pop up and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that. And I would say, whoa, it's telling me that I mess up. And that's where I see Jesus comes in, is that we don't throw anything away. We correct it as we're going along. We forgive as we're going along. You know that we may have to go back 2 months to forgive something that happened 2 months ago, but we can do it here when it happened 2 months ago. And sometimes we may need to be corrected. We may think that somebody else needs to forgive us, but we realize we did something and we're the ones that need to be corrected. And we're the ones that need to be forgiven. Like the word processor will let you know when you've messed up. Sometimes we need to be told that. And so we can see on this passage that Jesus is saying, guess what? We need to offer forgiveness. And we need to offer forgiveness more than 3 times. We need to offer forgiveness more than 7 times. Our forgiveness should be limitless. And then he gives a parable to explain all of this. And the parable is there's a person that owes this huge amount of money that will never, ever, ever be able to repay. And the owner is going to throw him in jail, and he pleads. And he says, I'll forgive you. I'll forgive your debt. And then that guy turns around and he goes to a person that owes him just basically not even a full year's wage. It's basically 100 days' wage. And he says, I'm throwing you in jail until you can repay me. If you throw somebody in jail, how are they going to work and repay the debt? They're not, right? He was giving him a life sentence for 100 days' wage. And then Jesus comes in the end and he says, guess what? We should be forgiving people. Now, some people get caught up on verse 35, and I'm just going to touch on it before we move on. Some people get caught up on this, and it says, my heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you do not forgive his brother from your heart. Meaning that if you withhold forgiveness, you can lose salvation. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. This isn't dealing with salvation. You can't lose your salvation. This is a parable that Jesus is giving here. What you can do is you can damage your relationship with God because you're withholding forgiveness with somebody else. But he's not dealing with salvation here. But you can damage your relationship. So the first part I want you to see is that Jesus taught that forgiveness is a core quality of his followers. Well, let's move on to the second point on your listening guide. Jesus not only taught, but also modeled forgiveness to his followers. Jesus not only taught, but also modeled forgiveness to his followers. So go ahead and turn over to Luke chapter 23. And this one here is that when Jesus is on the cross. Verse 33, I'll start at verse 33 and then we'll go on to 34. It says, when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. But Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots and divided up his garments among themselves. And the people stood by looking on, even the rulers who sneered at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of Jews, save yourself. Now there was also this inscription above him, This is the King of the Jews. And one of the criminals who hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other answered and rebuked him, You do not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation. We are indeed suffering justly, for we received what we deserve for our own deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. And it was about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. And because the sun was obscured and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Well, now Jesus, when he's on the cross, what he says here on the cross is, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, the interesting thing about what he's saying here is in the imperfect, which means that he's continuously saying to his Father to forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. So not just while he's there on the cross, but he's doing it the whole time, the whole process of going up to the cross and on the cross, he's asking God to forgive them the whole way through. He's offering forgiveness. And then there are ones that are there, the two thieves that are on his right and on his left, and one is hurling abuses at him. And he's saying, forgive him. Because he says they don't know what they're doing. The Roman soldiers that are down below him that are about to cast a dive for the clothes that he has. The ones that had beat him. The ones that were down at the bottom of the cross saying that if you're the Savior, then come on down. And he's asking God to forgive all of them. And then the other thief that is on the cross with him and said, remember me when you go to your kingdom, when you go to paradise. And what's Jesus say to him? And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. Meaning you're forgiven. And you can come to heaven with me. You see, Jesus taught about forgiveness. But it's one thing to teach about forgiveness. It's another thing to do it. Is it not? Like we can go up to somebody and say, you need to go forgive that person. But then when it happens to us and they come up and say, well, you need to forgive that person. No, don't tell me what I need to do. Jesus taught it, but not only did he teach it, but he modeled it so that we would know that we're supposed to forgive. And that it applied to him too. That he wasn't above the law. He was willing to forgive also. And he modeled it there on the cross by saying, Lord, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. But then he also did it at a very personal level. Go ahead and turn to John chapter 21. Now let me bring you up to speed as you're turning to remind you of what happened. This is coming after the Lord's Supper. Peter is there, and Peter told Jesus that he would die for him. And Jesus tells Peter, I'm telling you what, you're going to deny me 3 times before this night's over. Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter goes out, and what's he do? Denied him 3 times, right? The 3rd time he denies him, he hears the rooster crow, and he goes running off, weeping after the 3rd time. Now we come to this passage. This passage is after the resurrection. The disciples, they had been out fishing. They hadn't caught anything. And there's a gentleman that's on the shore, and he tells them, throw out on the right side. And so they throw out their net on the right side, and they catch 153 fish. Now, for fishermen out there, and I know I got a few in here, if you caught 153 fish in a day, would that be a good day? Yeah, as long as the game warden's not there, right? Then the person that Jesus loved, meaning John recognizes that it's Jesus, and he turns to Peter and he says, that's Jesus. Peter throws on his tunic, jumps in the water, swims to shore so that he could go up to Jesus. They all come together. They eat breakfast together. Jesus had cooked them breakfast. They all eat breakfast together. And then after that, Jesus calls Peter over. And we get to this passage. Look at verse 15. It says, so when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend to my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, shepherd my sheep. He said to him a 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, tend to my sheep. See, I think what's happening here is that Jesus is restoring Peter. Jesus is letting Peter know, I forgive you for denying me. Because how many times did Peter deny him? 3 times. How many times does Jesus say, do you love me? 3 times. And not only that, but every time after he said, do you love me? And he answered yes, he would say either tend to my lambs or tend to my sheep. Meaning, I'm forgiving you for what you've done. Now I need you to get back to what you need to do. Which is, I'm putting you in charge of this church. Tend to my sheep. People are going to be looking towards you. I forgive you for what you've done. And now it's time for you to get to work. And on the 3rd time that they were doing this, it says Peter was grieved. But we can see that Jesus was forgiving him. We can see that Jesus is forgiving somebody that had been with him for 3 years, had endured everything with him for 3 years, and then was betrayed by that same person. Turned his back on him. And Jesus saying, I'm forgiving you. I'll forgive you once, I'll forgive you twice, I'll forgive you 3 times. I'll forgive you. Now get back to work. See, if we've accepted the gospel, then we must be willing to forgive other people. You realize that? Because at the core of the gospel is forgiveness, because we've all sinned, right? And that means that we all need forgiveness. So the core of the gospel is that we are asking God to forgive us from where we've done wrong. And so if he forgives us, then that means that we then must forgive others. Because we've accepted the gospel, we've embraced the gospel, then that means we need to live the gospel. That means that we need to offer forgiveness to other people. Now, I know sometimes it is hard to forgive people that have hurt you. And I know people can do things that can really hurt you, cut you to the core. You're thinking, there's no way I'm ever going to forgive that person. We just don't get along. There's no way. It's kind of like this. See, you and that other person can be like oil and water. Oil and water does not mix, right? You can shake it up pretty good, and it looks like it's mixing up, but then look what happens. It starts to separate again, right? The oil's on the top and the water's on the bottom. And as much as you can try on your own to mix oil and water, it's not going to work. You realize that? But see, when we are like with somebody else, oil and water, and we just don't get along, there's no forgiveness there, and there needs to be forgiveness there, and we're trying to do it and we can't do it, we need to realize, wait a minute, there's a one part in this that's missing. See, the one part is Christ. And see, if you take a simple egg and you add it to oil and water, you know what you get? Oh, come on, y'all should know what you get. You get Duke's mayonnaise. Come on, everybody. You read this and it says the first ingredients are oil, eggs, and water. You take the oil and the water and you add in an egg yolk and you get mayonnaise. And see, what happens, well, we're not going to talk about that part. But here's what happens. A lot of times we try to do this on our own. I need to forgive this person, and we forget to include Christ in our forgiveness, and we can't realize why we can't forgive that person. Because we're trying to do it in our own strength. When we need to take Christ and put Him in the equation. And what He does is He bonds us together. Because He's forgiven of us, all of us. We just have to accept that forgiveness. So maybe for you today, you're saying, yeah, but you don't know what that person did. It doesn't matter if I do or don't know what that person did. It doesn't matter if y'all just can't get along at all. You realize that? Because when you add Christ to the equation, you can forgive anybody for what they've done. Now, don't read into this. I'm not saying that you got to be best friends with that person going forward, right? But you can forgive that person going forward instead of holding on to that forgiveness. Because when we hold on to that forgiveness, it weighs us down. That's why He wants us to forgive people, so that we take that burden off of us and we place it on Him. Our bottom line is simple. At the core of the gospel is forgiveness. At the core of the gospel is forgiveness. When somebody does something to hurt us, and I didn't say maybe, but when, because somebody's going to do something to you one day to hurt you. You have to remember what Christ has taught us. And that is that we are to forgive others because He's forgiven us. And if we've embraced the gospel, then that means we also need to live the gospel out, which means we need to forgive others when they've done something to us. So when I first talked about forgiveness, what person popped in your mind? Because most of the time when we talk about forgiveness, we're holding forgiveness from somebody, and a name or a face will pop into your mind. Do you need to forgive that person? Now, I don't know if you'll be able to restore the relationship, but can you forgive that person? Have you tried adding Christ into that equation to forgive that person? Maybe your response today is the altar's open. You're more than welcome to come and just pray. Lord, you know how I feel. You know what this person has done. Help me to forgive this person. Maybe you're here today and you've never received forgiveness yourself, meaning you've never given your life to Christ. He's offered forgiveness, but you've never embraced that forgiveness. I'll be down front and be glad to share with you how you can have His forgiveness. For others of you, are you willing to offer forgiveness to others? Even the ones that have hurt you the most. All right, let's close in prayer. Lord,